everybody. So I'm here to introduce Davina Two Bears, and she is Diné, or Navajo, originally from Bird Springs, Arizona. Her maternal clan is Bitterwater. Her maternal grandfather clan is Edgewater. And she can go much deeper into any of those details if she would like. She's a daughter, she's a sister, she's a mother of 3, and I know from personal experience she makes the meanest batch of Indian fried bread that anybody can do. But most importantly today, she is a scholar with impressive credentials. She has a bachelor's degree in anthropology from Dartmouth College. She has a master's degree in sociology from Northern Arizona University. Did I say sociocultural anthropology? That's what I meant to say. And she's a doctoral candidate at Indiana University, and she's in the final days of finishing details on her dissertation, which is in the Archaeology in Social Context program. She also has a minor at the doctoral level in Native American and Indigenous Studies. In short, she is a keeper of knowledge, both academic and traditional, and St. Joseph's College is very, very lucky to have her sharing her wisdom with us today. So if we could welcome Davina.
Hello? 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 Thank you, Patricia, for that wonderful introduction. And Kimberly, I wanted to say thank you to St. Joseph's College for inviting me. I've been having a wonderful day meeting faculty and students and visiting some classes. So yeah, Davina Two Bears, Yinishia, Twitichi, Nishlin, Tachi, Bashishi, Tabahi Nashiche, No Twitichi, Nationali, City Twit, Nasha, Do Indiana University. I'm Navajo, originally from Northern Arizona, and I'm Bitterwater and born for Red Running Into the Water clan. I'm also, my maternal grandfather is Edgewater and my paternal grandfather is Bitterwater. I'm going to, I'm originally from Bird Springs, Arizona on the Navajo Reservation, which is in northern Arizona. So my research is a very personal project. It stems from what my grandfather and grandmother told me when I was a child. They shared stories of attending the Old Leupp Boarding School, and this school was a place where Navajo students were, it was run by the federal government. It's part of the Federal Indian Boarding School, and it was a policy of the United States government to assimilate Native American children into Western society, and part of that assimilation was through taking children from families and putting them into boarding schools at the age of 5 and until they graduated. And these boarding schools were located all over the United States. And I think probably the nearest one to here on the East Coast is the Carlisle Indian School, which was the first boarding school, federal Indian boarding school was opened in the late 1800s. And there were also boarding schools on or near Indian reservations. And my grandparents went to the Old Leupp Boarding School, so they told me stories. My grandfather shared that he was, one of the stories he shared was that he was starving and he wanted to, him and his friends wanted to find a way to feed themselves. So what he did was he had his, he got a toy gun for Christmas at the Leupp Boarding School, and he made that toy gun into a real gun. And him and his friends would take that real gun, and they would go hunting for rabbits around the boarding school, and then they would build a fire, and they would cook the rabbits and eat them. And he used to tell me the story just to entertain me, but my mother told me that the reason why they were doing that was because they were starving at the boarding school. And my grandmother told me stories about how when she was, I would ask her where she got these tattoos that were on her hands and her arms. And she said when she was in the boarding school, her the big girls would hold her down and would forcefully give her tattoos, even though she didn't want them. And so there was some bullying that was going on. And they would just tell me these stories. And my grandfather was also very upset with the boarding school because the boarding school, or the federal government, he wanted the buildings. He thought that they were really, really beautiful historic buildings, and he thought that it was wrong for the federal government to bulldoze all of those buildings. They were made of local sandstone, and he was upset because he thought that they were still useful, and he didn't think that the government should have just tore them down. And they did that sometime in the 1960s. This place, the Old Leupp Boarding School, is really important to the Navajo people in my community. It's a lot of people have oral history about this school, and it is a place that they would like to know more about. And as part of my feasibility study for my project, I interviewed teachers that taught at schools on the reservation in the area, and what they wanted was more material that they could use in their classrooms, like curriculum, I guess, or even just any kind of written history. And when I worked for, before I went to school, back to school, I was a tribal archaeologist, and I did a project with Northern Arizona University, and at the site of the Old Leupp Boarding School. And I didn't realize that that's where, I guess I just didn't really think about it until I was out there. I had to work with kids to help them identify historic features on the ground and the debris. And then when I participated in this project, I realized that this is the school where my grandparents went, and it was a huge archaeological site. The school occupied about 125 square acres. There was a lot of different buildings there, and I really was interested in learning more about this place, but there's nothing written. The only thing that I found written was usually just the date the school was open, and this is how it looks out there. This is a sidewalk I'm standing next to, and then some of the leftover sandstone blocks. So there's a lot of sandstone in this area near Leupp, and the buildings were made of local sandstone. So these are just some pictures of the site. And so as I was out there working, I realized that there's nothing written about this school, nor has this school been recorded as an archaeological site. The only thing that has been documented about this school was that in 1943, after the school closed, it was used as a Japanese isolation center for quote-unquote troublemakers from all the other Japanese internment camps. So there was about 70 Japanese men that were interred at the Leupp Boarding School in 1943 for 9 months. And the Park Service has published a book on the Japanese internment camps, so they dedicate one of the chapters to the Leupp Isolation Center, and that's the only thing that's written about this school. So these are just some of the features that you can see on the ground. So culture resource management on the Navajo Reservation is done as part of the development process. So anytime you want to build something, you have to have an environmental clearance and also an archaeological clearance. Basically, what I did as a tribal archaeologist was to document sites on the ground and try to avoid them if there was something being built. And so, but this kind of archaeology doesn't really allow for you to research places very in-depth with a lot of participation from the community, because these projects have to be done quickly in order to save time and money, because people are waiting for things like water and electricity, because a lot of Navajo families to this day, like 30% of Navajos living on the reservation do not have running water or electricity. So it's still, and a lot of the roads are dirt roads too. So that's how CRM is done on the reservation. And part of the documentation is documenting not only archaeological sites, both ancient, like thousands of years old, but also recent sites that are 50 years and older. So those are all archaeological sites. And we also document sacred and religious places on the Navajo Reservation, because our culture, we have a lot of natural places that are important to our people, like mountaintops, for example, are very sacred places where we don't like to disturb those areas or have people walking around those areas, because they're used in our religion and in our ceremonies to this day. And so those are like an example of some sacred places. So we have to identify those places as well. Archaeologists today, what I observed was that there was a preference by archaeologists to research ancient Puebloan sites over historic Navajo sites. So Navajo sites usually didn't get much research done on them to begin with because of the CRM process, the cultural resource management process. But when stuff was researched, what was researched were the ancient Puebloan sites more so than the historic Navajo sites. So there are historic Navajo sites all over the reservation that are not being documented or researched, but are important to the communities. And I wanted to do that kind of archaeology. That's why I decided to go back to school at Indiana University. But then I'm not a traditional archaeologist because digging makes me uncomfortable. But I like the field of archaeology. So I want to do research of archaeological sites differently. I want to use non-destructive research methods. For me, what is comfortable is learning about sites from my own people through oral history, and doing interviews, and also archival research. And that's how I decided I wanted to do research the site. And it's decolonizing research because I'm a Navajo from the community and I'm researching a place important to my community. I'm not just researching a place that is in the right-of-way of some project. I'm researching a place that my people want to know more about. And my goal is to share that information with them, which doesn't happen with archaeological projects. They get archived, and Navajo people don't have a chance to read those reports because the only people that are allowed to look at those reports are other archaeologists. And usually that's the situation, but sometimes archaeologists will put money in their budgets to do a publication for the public, but that's really rare. So I want to change that. And that's one of the reasons I went back to school, so that I could research places that are important to my people and also share that information with them. So Leupp, again, is on the southwestern part of the reservation. And right here is the Little Colorado River. And if you keep going north, it'll eventually join the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. So here's Old Leupp, and there's a road right here right now, a paved road, and another paved road here that goes to Winslow. So and this is a map of the reservation. And you can see all of the different boarding schools that were built on the reservation. Here's the Tuba City Boarding School, and here's the Leupp Boarding School. So on the western half of the reservation in the early 20th century, there was only two schools, boarding schools, and that was Leupp and Tuba City. And if you go to the Old Leupp site, this is the northern part of the site, and this is a dike right here. It's an earthen mound about 8 feet high, and here is the San Francisco Peaks. And for my people, they're called Do'osli, and that means glittering mountains. And we have 4 sacred mountains in our religion and our culture, and this is the western sacred mountain, which is clearly visible from the site of the Old Leupp Boarding School. The site goes this way, south, so this photo is facing west, and this is the north part of the site, and the rest of the site is this way. And there's a couple of families that live in Old Leupp. They occupy houses that once belonged to the staff. So basically the whole campus was bulldozed in the 1960s, except for, I think 2 or 3 houses were left standing because there were Navajo people living in those houses. So what I was interested in researching in my research in this project was the resistance of Navajo children against assimilation. And this school opened in 1909 and it closed in 1902. And I used, I used non-destructive research methods, which included archival research and also oral history with Navajo elders. And my research contributes to post-colonial anthropology, and it's a study of resistance and survivance within the boarding school. The Leupp Boarding School, when it was first opened in 1909, there's a story about how, well, not a story, but in one of the archival records, I found documentation that there was a terrible flood when the school first opened and the river was flowing high. And as a result, parents, they were forced to wade across the river to bring their children to school. And since the school could only take about 70 students, a lot of the families were being turned away. And to me, this was a very interesting documentation that I found, because I was thinking about how was it that families were voluntarily bringing their children to this boarding school, and they were crossing a river, which you can see, this is how it would flood around the Old Leupp Boarding School. Here's a dike right here. Because the narrative that you hear about boarding schools is that children were forcefully taken away from their parents. But I found in the archival records that children were being brought by their parents. And I was wondering I wonder what compelled these parents to bring their children, to cross this dangerous river and try and bring their kids to boarding school. And one of the only documented oral history about the Leupp Boarding School is from Hope, the SOC, and he said he remembers that Navajo men would be, I guess, kind of like deputized, or like Navajo police, and they would go to houses and threaten the families and say, if you don't bring your children to school, we will throw the father in jail. And so, was this happening to families when the school first opened? Or were there other reasons why they were bringing their children to the boarding school? But it's just an interesting thing to think about, an image of the families bringing their kids through the running water, the river, because that river is really dangerous when it's running. Like in these pictures, it's like a flash flood, and there's a lot of things that are in the water because the water is like really muddy and you can't see, and what's floating in the water, like trees and stuff like that, or dead animals. So, one of the first buildings that was built on the school was this building here. It was built in 1909. It was a dormitory, a kitchen, a dining hall, and a school. And later on, one of the things that the superintendent was always writing to the Indian commissioner was that they needed more room. They needed more room at the school, and so in the 1920s, they did build several buildings. They built this dining hall, which was a separate building just south of the dormitory, and then they built an actual school building. Both the dormitory and the school building had a courtyard in the middle, which was an open courtyard. And I believe in the courtyard is where they would have a basketball court. And one of the elders, Mr. Alex Riggs, he remembers that written on the school right there is Leupp Indian School 1923 right there. So I couldn't read what that said, and so he told me what it said because he remembered it from when he was a child going to school there. There was also a hospital. It was built to the west of the school building. And here you can see the school building, and there's the hospital, and there's the river right there. So the school had a dormitory, dining room, an actual school building, and a dining hall, and the school. And later on, one of the things that the superintendent was always writing to the Indian commissioner was that they needed more room. They needed more room at the school, and so in the 1920s they did build several buildings. They built this dining hall, which was a separate building just south of the dormitory, and then they built an actual school building. Both the dormitory and the school building had a courtyard in the middle, which was an open courtyard. And I believe in the courtyard is where they would have a basketball court. And one of the elders, Mr. Alex Riggs, he remembers that written on the school right there is Leupp Indian School, 1923, right there. So I couldn't read what that said, and so he told me what it said, because he remembered it from when he was a child going to school there. There was also a hospital. It was built to the west of the school building. And here you can see the school building, and there's the hospital, and there's the river right there. So the school had a dormitory, dining room, an actual school building, and a hospital, and all these buildings were built in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, as a result, the enrollment went up from about 70 students to about 400 students. And these are all from the local area. There's 3 communities around Leupp Boarding School. There's a Leupp community. There is Talani Lake and Bird Springs, where I'm from. And so children were coming from all these areas to attend school here. Here is the powerhouse. This is where they burned coal to provide the heat and hot water. And the electricity was from acetylene gas. And they had a pipeline that would go from the school into the Little Colorado River, which was where the sewage was going directly into the river. So they didn't have a sewage treatment plant. And when the school would flood, like it flooded several times, you can just imagine that, the children were having to, and the people who worked there, deal with the flood, but also, probably their sewer system would get backed up because they were dumping the sewage directly into the water, the river, and that's not very healthy. So this is an overview of the campus. This is the historic map I found that was drawn in 1941. And I found this map. I knew it existed, but I found it in the Japanese internment records because I had been looking for it in Washington, D.C., and I couldn't find it in the boarding school records, but when I looked in the Japanese internment records, then I found this map. And here's the school. You can see the courtyard. The dormitory. Here's the school. There's the dining hall. There's the hospital. Here's the trading post. Here's the dike. In the early 20th century, the river was on this side. It changed the channel. You can see it right here. Then the channel switched, and it started going south and west of the school. And I was always wondering why the dike was on the east side. I was like, why is it on that side when the river's on the other side? But then in reading the archival records, I realized that the channel had changed. I want to read you a little bit from Hopeton SOC. His is the only published oral history about the boarding school, and he writes, "Conditions at the school were terrible. Food and other supplies were not too plentiful. We were underfed, so we were constantly hungry. Clothing was not good, and in winter months there were epidemics of sickness. Sometimes students died, and the school would shoot clothes for the rest of the term. It was run in a military fashion and rules were very strict. The first year I didn't attend many classes because of lonesomeness. Being small and young, I couldn't adjust to things and I cried much of the time. 3 of my father's younger sisters were also going to school there. They were teenagers, and when I got lonesome and started to cry, they would come and comfort me. They used to take turns going around with me. And so, this is a satellite image of how it looks today with the map layered on top. So, this is the population of the school. This is a graph of the different reasons why students dropped out of the school. So when I looked at enrollment records in Washington, D.C., they were not consistent for every year the school was open, but I took looked at all the records and in the area where they listed the reasons why students dropped out. That's what I put in this graph. And so it was surprising to me that there was, like Hope Dinesosi talked about, according to the enrollment records, there were 24 children that passed away, and that was really sad for me to read that. One of the biggest reasons why students, quote unquote, they were listed under dropping out was that they were transferred. And the years that they were transferred were the years when there was a flood that occurred at the school. So they would transfer students. And some of the elders remember this. They remember it flooding and they had to go to different schools, like in Tuba City, and then also in the city of Winslow. There was also not a boarding school, but a dormitory that was run by the government for Indian kids to stay there and attend public schools. So that's what the reason why the transfer was the highest number at 82. And there was a huge problem with trachoma, which is a disease that affects the eyes. It's passed from, not washing your hands. I guess it's, it was a big problem for Navajo people in the early 20th century, as well as tuberculosis. And a lot of the children that came to Leupp had the sickness as well, and they had to be treated for that. And sometimes, again, there was deaths at the school. I guess a lot of the stories that the children or the elders shared with me, I like to talk about how in our culture we have stories that are called coyote stories, and these are told to children. And to me, for our people, they teach lessons. And they teach both how to behave and how not to behave. And coyote is usually an example. He does what you're not supposed to do. But what they also teach, like coyote, was he would lie and cheat and steal and brag about himself and try to take things from the other animals. And he did a lot of the times. He would trick them. But this didn't happen every single time. The animals would also fight back. They wouldn't let him get away with things. They would use their own tricks to get back at Coyote. And they would either harm him or harm his children, or kill his children if Coyote tried to bother them or steal from them. And I feel like these are the stories that were taught to children in our culture in the early 20th century. It was one of the major ways that our children, Navajo children, were educated. And I think these stories serve as a real, like an example, because the the elders that I talked to, for example, Ardith Curley, she talks about how she was, I don't have a picture of her, but here are some of the elders that I spoke with. Some of the elders, they didn't want their names or their picture taken. But she talked about how when she was at the boarding school, the matrons, who are the ladies that are taking care of the kids in the boarding schools, they would take all of the fruit in the dining hall for themselves, and they wouldn't leave any fruit for the children. And so the girls, in the girls' dormitory, they would, at night or when the matrons weren't around, they would go back and they would steal all the fruit back from the matrons. And they would also steal food from the bakery at night, or the baker at night. They would steal bread from the baker. And other elders would tell me about how they stole food from the dining hall by putting food in their clothing, like in their socks, because they weren't supposed to take food from the dining hall. Or they would put them, I guess the girls had to wear bloomers, and so they would put like food in the bloomers, like the bloomers came to their mid-thigh, and there was elastic there, and they were poofy, so they would fill their bloomers with food and walk out of the dining hall. To me, these just represent, they are not victims of their situations. They were trying to use their, what they had, and I feel like if they were being taught these coyote stories, the stories are inspiring them to not be victims, to fight back and to take care of themselves through stealing back from those who are hurting them, or trying to keep food from them. So I feel that the tradition was still there within the boarding school. And another example of that is one elder, her name is Hope Denesosi, and she talks about her grandparents coming to the school and feeding her. So they would not only feed her, but they would tell her to invite her friends. So they would park right outside of that dike, and they'd come in their wagon, and they would build a fire, and they would cook Navajo foods like mutton. A lot of our people, we eat sheep and goats. They would cook sheep and fry bread and invite, and their granddaughters, they had 2 granddaughters, and invite them and their granddaughters' friends. So they would feed them these traditional foods, and also they would bring other kinds of foods like watermelon and pinon nuts, which is very important for a lot of tribes in the Southwest. And they were feeding their children at the boarding school because they weren't allowed to take them. So, but they would go there and they would see their grandchildren and feed them. Not only feed their friends too, but also Hope remembers, and there's 2 sisters, Hope and Lucinda, that their grandparents also donated food to the Leupp Boarding School. So when they would start harvesting their corn, because along the Little Colorado River, there was a lot of families that had huge cornfields, and Hope and Lucinda's family, when the corn was ready, they would load up a bunch of corn and squash and melons, and they would donate that to the school so the kids can have fresh food. And to me, that's such an endearing story of keeping that relationship between grandparents and child, which is a very important relationship in a lot of Native communities, because the grandparents are the ones that teach the children the traditions and the language, and are, taking care of the children, educating them. And this is a continuation of that relationship. At Navajo, it's called and means your relationship with not only your blood relatives, but your relatives related to you by clan. Anyone that has the same clans as I do is my relatives. And so is relatives taking care and taking loving care of one another. And and this relationship continued for these two granddaughters, even though they weren't allowed to leave the school. Their grandparents came to see them and would feed them. I don't know how much time I have left. 5 minutes. This is just an example of the schedule at the Leupp Boarding School. And they had to get up at 5:45 in the morning and do, there was I think a bugle call in the morning. They had to go to church on certain days in the evening. Let's see. You can't really see this slide, but this is from the 1920s. And in the enrollment records, I found my grandmother's name. I didn't find my grandfather's name, but I found my grandmother's name. And it was so special for me. I cried when I was in the National Archives. Her name is Ruth B. Curley. And when they took this record, she was 7 years old. And it was from 1927, January 1927. So most of the kids that were 10 years and younger would have this written by their name, school all day. And then kids that were 10 years all the way up until like 19 years old, they would be in vocational training. There was a lot of different jobs assigned to them. The girls usually worked in the kitchen and the laundry. And earlier in the 20th century, they were also assigned to the hospital. But then the boys, they had more options. They had blacksmith, carpentry, gardening, farm, and they also worked in the powerhouse. And one of the things that was happening that I found in the records is that the school was detaining the teenagers. So they would detain them in the same grades. The school only went up to the 8th grade, but they had students there all the way up until like 19 years old. So they were detaining the older teenage boys in the same grade, like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade for like 3 or 4 years because they were using them to work in the farm. And the boys were only in the farm, and their inspection reports by the government inspectors, they commented on why they were detaining these older boys and only allowing them to work in the farm and not go to school. And they need to stop doing that because these boys need to go to school, and they also need to learn different vocational trades. So that was just something interesting that I read in the archival records. There's, this is Alex Riggs, and he's a leader in the Leupp community, and he was a council delegate, which is like a senator for the Navajo tribe for many years. And this is my late uncle. He just passed away a couple years ago, which really made me sad. And this is also a relative to my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and her name is Gertie Curley, or it was Gertie Curley, now it's Gertie Hijo, and she talks a lot about how she used to love playing baseball at school. So that was her favorite thing to do all the time. And she would get in trouble for playing baseball and not listening, and like they would say, "It's time to go watch a movie." And she would say, "No, I want to play baseball." And she had to sew sacks as her punishment for not listening. And she also told me that whenever the students came back from school and the church would want them to get baptized because they were assuming that Navajo children were participating in their Navajo ceremonies over the summer, and they were trying to force her to be baptized when she came back to school, and she said, "No, I'm not going to be baptized." And she was proud of the fact, like, she said, "To this day, I haven't been baptized." Even though she says she's a Christian now, too. So, I guess in conclusion, I just really am so grateful to have this opportunity to learn about my own heritage and learn about all these stories that the elders told me about their experience there. And some of the stories, they were about being punished for speaking their language and culture, but they did what they could to continue speaking their language within the boarding school. And also the boarding school did things that I didn't realize that helped their culture as well. Like they had Navajo weaving classes. And when you usually hear about the boarding school narrative is that they don't allow culture or the language, but this school, they were teaching the girls how to weave. And within the weaving classes, the teacher and the teacher was Navajo and they could speak the Navajo language. So it complicates the narrative of boarding schools. My research, there's positive stories and negative stories. And I thought it was really significant that at the school they were teaching the girls to weave rugs because that's a traditional Navajo craft. And they were teaching them all stages from dyeing the wool with plants all the way to spinning the wool and then weaving the wool into rugs. And at the museum in Window Rock, Arizona, the Navajo Museum, I found a lot of photographs there taken in 1939 of the Leupp kids at the boarding school. And after the elders told me they were learning to weave at the school, I found this picture, and this is Marie Martin. She was the Navajo teacher. And this is a picture that was shared by Ardith Curley, just showing the boys playing on the playground. And then this picture is really cute because the little kids are learning about animals. There's some chickens that they're holding, and here is a porcupine. There used to be a lot of porcupines along the Little Colorado River because there used to be a lot of cottonwood trees, big cottonwood trees. But the invasive tamarisk I think it's from the Middle East, but it was brought to the Southwest, and it has choked out a lot of the native plants and trees. And that's what happened along the Little Colorado River. And these girls are dyeing paper. And this is another thing. They're learning how to make a fire with sticks at school. And so I thought that was pretty funny that they were teaching them how to make fire, but also significant because it's a traditional way to make fire, and another Navajo tradition being taught to school children within the context of a federal Indian boarding school that was their job was to assimilate children, but that did not necessarily always happen, is what I found in my research. And I would just like to say thank you again for having me. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
questions? I can run to you.
Are there any boarding schools still in existence? Did they all get bulldozed? No, sorry.
There are boarding schools. A lot of them have closed, but it's different now. Like now the schools on the reservation, it is their goal to teach the language and culture, including the boarding schools. So in Leupp, there still is a boarding school. It's right across the street from the public school. So yeah, that they still exist in the United States. I don't know. I think the Sherman Institute might still exist too in Riverside, California. That's where a lot of tribes go to in the Southwest. They attend Sherman Institute.
Student questions, come on.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh.
I can just yell. I'm good. What was your favorite coyote story?
Oh gosh. I don't know any by heart. I know there's some that are like there's a lot of them. Like the reason why Coyote has yellow eyes is that he was watching the birds who were taking their eyeballs out, throwing them up in the air, and they would somehow, the birds would catch their eyeballs and it would pop back in their eyes. And then Coyote was like, I want to do that, I want to do that. And they're like, no, don't do this, you can't do it, you don't know how. And they kept playing that way with their eyeballs, and he was like, I want to do it, I want to do it. And they're like, no, you're not going to, you can't do it, you don't know how, you're just going to hurt yourself. And he was like, no. And so in Navajo stories, it's always 4. So he asked 4 times, and finally they said, fine, you can do it. And so they let him do that, and he lost his eyeballs, and he couldn't find them. And so what he did was he popped it into his eyes, and that's why he has yellow eyes. So stories like that. So that would probably teach, now it's working. It would probably teach children to, stay out of other people's business because you might get hurt. And you don't know, what will happen if you don't know how to do something properly.
I'll just talk. So you mentioned that one of the reasons why you started doing this research is to bring it back to the Navajo country. How would you share this if you were back there?
Well, I'm definitely this summer I'm planning to go to the different communities and have a day where I will do like a presentation and share what I've learned. I also hope that I can publish my research as a book, and I would really like to work with teachers too. I'm interested in either writing a story for children, which I actually am as part of my dissertation. The last chapter in my dissertation is a fictionalized story about a girl who goes back in time, and she's trying to help the kids. She's Navajo herself, and she goes back in time to accidentally, and she's trying to help the Navajo kids and at the boarding school, and then she comes back to the future, I guess, and she meets some elders who remembered her, and they were like, they introduced themselves to her again and said, do you remember me? You helped me when we were at the boarding school. And so I want to write that story for kids based on my research. But also I'm interested in working because the teachers I talked to in my Navajo, or in my feasibility study, they wanted material curriculum, especially from a Navajo perspective, about the boarding school, the Leupp Boarding School, so they can use that to teach about the history of it in their classes. So I would really like to work with them to develop that, or even just give them my research so they can develop something themselves. But I think it would be great to develop curriculum.
Hi, thank you for your stories. How are the generations who went to the boarding school? How were they assimilated? Were they not assimilated? How are they different from the other generations?
Well, I think that they were, because they were in some respects, I guess. If they totally were, then the Navajo language and culture would not exist right now, but it does. So a lot of the students were, they managed to keep their language, but it's that generation that made the decision of whether or not they were going to teach their children the language. So some of them didn't teach their children the language. Like my grandparents, they didn't encourage my mother to speak Navajo, but they would make fun of her next when she did speak Navajo, or they would tell her she's saying things wrong. So my grandparents spoke Navajo fluently, and they spoke English fluently. My mother understands Navajo, but she doesn't speak it because she has a hard time trying to say things, and she can't. It's really hard for her to try and express herself in the Navajo language, and she really can't do that. And so I'm now the third generation. So because my mother couldn't express herself in Navajo, she just only taught us, words and phrases. And so I don't speak Navajo fluently, and I don't understand Navajo to the level that my mother does. So I'm an example of the assimilation having, I guess, an effect. But there are other Navajo families where that's not the case, like my brother-in-law, who speaks Navajo. But he told me that he made himself speak Navajo because his parents didn't force him to speak Navajo. So his other siblings, he has 3 other siblings, they don't speak Navajo, but he wanted to learn the Navajo language, so he made himself speak only Navajo, or not only Navajo, but learn Navajo, even though his parents didn't force him to, but they definitely helped him to learn it because they saw that he had an interest. So he speaks Navajo, but he didn't speak Navajo to his children all the time, so they don't speak Navajo. So it's like, there's a lot of Navajo people that still do speak the language, but it definitely had an effect, that disrupting of our family dynamics. The education that goes from elders to the younger generation was disrupted, and being in the boarding school. But at the same time, the federal government didn't totally succeed because there's still a lot of Navajo people that speak Navajo and practice our culture and religion, and also have an interest of continuing to practice the language, the culture, and the religion, and teach it to their children.
Thank you as well, Davina. In our Maine history class earlier this semester, we had a visitor who talked about compiling a dictionary for the Penobscot tribe here in Maine. Have you had any contact with any of the Wabanaki people from northern New England? And if so, have you noticed any of the similarities or differences between your own experience back in northern Arizona?
No, I have met some who live around Hanover, and I'm going to be teaching a course this spring on Native American contemporary music. That's another interest of mine. And I'm inviting a guest speaker to my class, and he's Abenaki, and he's learning his language, and what he does is he sings songs in the Abenaki language with his guitar, and that is how he's learning his language, is through singing contemporary songs, but incorporating the Abenaki language. So he's an individual that I really wanted to invite in my class because he represents someone from the area, a tribe from the area, and also someone who's doing using music to learn and save his language, which is what a lot of tribes all over the country and Canada, that's one thing that a lot of tribes do. Even in South America, there's an indigenous woman, her name is Renata Flores. She uses, she sings like hip hop music in Quechua language, and she's trying to save her language, making it appealing to the younger generation through hip hop music. So that's something I think, to me, that's really significant for tribes, is to save their language through music, connecting to the younger generation.
So, of the 82 children who were transferred out of the boarding school during the flood, do you know where they went, where they were relocated? Or?
Yeah, there was several episodes of flooding at the Leupp Boarding School. I haven't nailed down the exact dates of when, except for that one that was in the photograph, because it was dated. But they would transport them to schools like I said, Sherman Institute in Riverside, California. Another popular place was Fort Apache in I think that's in White River, Arizona, I believe. So that's on the Apache Reservation, and I think even there were a couple that went to Phoenix Indian School, and I think yeah, from if I can remember right, those were some of the places that they went. So Riverside, Phoenix Indian School, Fort Apache, Tuba City, which was up north, and then also in Winslow as well. So those schools that were all of them were like federal Indian boarding schools.
In that list of the students that left and the reasons why, there was one listed as outing. What is that?
Oh yeah, an outing is, this is a program that a lot of the federal Indian boarding schools practice. They would not send the children home during the summertime, but they would send them to do work. And for example, the boys got sent to beet fields in Colorado to work, and that was their outing. And then some of the girls participated in an outing, but they didn't write where they went. So I don't know what they did, but typically when you read about federal Indian boarding schools, the girls who did outings were assigned to people's homes, like as housekeepers. So this is what they were learning in their vocational training. They weren't learning to be doctors, lawyers, and engineers. They were learning to be laborers, like on the farm, or the women as housekeepers, and working as maids or in the laundry, doing laundry. So these are the vocational training that was received from the federal government, because they didn't want to invest in the students and going beyond those fields.
those careers.
Okay, one more quick one. Just follow up on that. Have you seen any? Has there been any evidence that any of the boys were sent to the Indian lines?
I'm not sure if they were. Those jobs were voluntary because Navajo people, they have we're taught to be very industrious, especially in the early 20th century. Children were taught to be strong because if you aren't strong, then you can't take care of yourself. So parents would have their children get up before the sun rises and they would run, to make them run to the east. And during the first snows, they would make you roll in the snow naked or take ice baths. And this is something that children had to do. And so they were brought up to be very strong, and they were given responsibilities at a very young age, like starting at age 5, you would be going out with the sheep herd and watching the sheep all day, and then you would bring them back in the evening at 5 years old. And by the time you're 8 years old, you can walk like 22 miles a day without eating anything all day. And what you would do is, there's this one woman, her name is Ruth Rosell, and she talks about how she was sent on the mountain with the sheep, her and her cousin, and they lived out there all week with the sheep, and they wouldn't have anything to eat. They would drink the goat's milk for their food, and then that was like 22 miles away from her home in the mountains, and then they would come back like a week later because they would be so hungry and they would want, real food. So things like that, that's how children were raised, and they were raised to take care of themselves and to be healthy and strong. And the philosophy was something like, if it is meant to be, it's up to me. So if you find yourself in a situation like in jail or something, it's like, well, you're the one that are responsible for being in there. You did whatever you did to get in there. If you don't want to be in jail, then you have to stop doing those things that are going to put you in jail. So it's up to you. If you don't want to be hungry, if you don't want to be poor, if you don't want to be starving, it's up to you to make that change in whatever you're doing to take care of yourself. And I think this philosophy really helped children survive boarding schools as well. If they were hungry, or if they were, especially with my grandfather's story, he took it upon himself to make a gun out of a toy gun so that he could kill rabbits and feed himself. So it was up to him to change his situation, and he did. And even though he was just a kid, he did that if it was, he wanted to change his situation, so he did. And that's a philosophy that young children are taught, especially in the early 20th century. That was what they were encouraged to do. Did I answer your question?
Not quite.
Wait, what was your question? Oh yeah. So the mining then was a really hard, or not really hard, but it was a way for families to continue that tradition of taking care of themselves. And they were proud to be miners. It was hard work, and they could see the results of their hard work because they could, buy things. They could, take care of their families, take care of their children. Little did they know that uranium causes cancer. Nobody told them that. But that tradition of working
in a mine and working hard continued with coal mining, which happened in the 1960s. You know, again, there's like a it's a contradiction, I guess, kind of, because you're doing what you're supposed to be doing as a Navajo, which is working hard to take care of yourself and your family, but you're also going against our culture because you're tearing up Mother Earth. And the Black Mesa is considered a sacred place where they do the coal mining, and it's like you're ripping out the Mother Earth. You're ripping off of her skin and taking out her liver, because that's what they believe the coal is. The coal is the liver of Mother Earth, and that's sacrilegious to do that. So it's like a contradiction where families are able to take care of themselves, but it comes at a price because they're disrespecting Mother Earth and they're causing her harm.
Well, I think that we're good. Thank you so much for visiting our campus.